All right. Hey guys. So, in today's lecture, we are going to cover probably the most famous event preceding the American Revolution, and that is the Boston Tea Party. And we'll talk about the events directly leading up to the first shots of the American Revolution. So, we're almost there. So, the Boston Tea Party begins on the night of December 16th, 1773. Keep in mind, the last bloodshed that we saw was the very famous Boston Massacre, which was where 5 people tragically lost their lives in that riot that happened with British soldiers in the streets of Boston in 1770. Remember, that was March 5th, 1770. And so this is well over 3 years later. And what's happened, remember, is that Britain has repealed all of those Townshend Acts, those duties on enumerated goods like glass, paper, lead, paint, porcelain, etc., except for one of those taxes. And the only tax that they left in place, kind of to exert their authority, their will, Parliament's will over the colonies, was the tax on tea. There you go, the Tea Act. And that Parliament will actually pass a separate tea tax, a tea act, in the beginning of 1773. Now, the reason that they do this is a little bit shady, okay? We've talked about the business influences before, and this is something that's very relevant to today in our politics as well. Members of the United States Congress today, they get a lot of money, we call PACs and stuff. They get a lot of campaign contributions, money to their campaigns and personal bribe money, basically, um, throughout the course of their political careers. And a lot of these businesses give this money in an effort to try to push that elected official to help their business out. Okay, and this is a practice that goes way, way back, and we're specifically talking about it here with the Boston Tea Party, because many members of parliament had direct ties or connections with the business leaders of the very big, very powerful British East India Tea Company that actually got most of its tea out of China. So that is why this Tea Act was kind of the one tax that Britain wasn't really willing to let go, because members of parliament, they needed for this company, the British East India Company, to not go bankrupt, because then that would hurt their own personal finances as well. So again, really shady, kind of crooked, corrupt stuff going on. And so Parliament passes this Tea Act. This is the one tax that's left, kind of an extension of the Declaratory Act. Britain also, in a political sense, Parliament and the King are telling the colonies, hey, we've repealed all this other stuff, but we have to tax you, okay? There has to be some way that we get some money from you. And that sets the stage for this. And this isn't just going to be taking place in Boston. There were a number of tea parties where tea will either be sent back unopened back to London, or it will be dumped, or it will just sit and rot in storage houses in many different cities all across the eastern coast of the American colonies. They did this in Charleston, New York, Philadelphia. But the most famous by far, and the thing that's going to have the most consequences, was the Tea Party in Boston. And by the way, nobody called it a tea party when this happened. They called it the destruction of the tea. I think Tea Party is probably a little bit more catchy, so good on them. I forgot to let the cat out. I'll just do that later. She'll be fine. Yay. Okay. But anyway, so that is what's going on. And in the Old South Meeting Hall, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, including Mr. Samuel Adams, don't forget about him, they are talking about the injustice of this tea that is on these 3 American-owned ships that had just come in from London. And there's all these crates of tea. Now, by the way, tea at this time kind of looks like this. You see this picture here? Those are tea bricks, kind of where you take the tea leaves and you compress them after steeping them. So that's actually what was in the crates that are going to be tossed in the harbor, these bricks of tea. which also kind of explains why they were so heavy. There were like hundreds of thousands of tons that were dropped in Boston Harbor on the night of the Tea Party. Basically, Boston Harbor was a giant teapot, they called it. So much tea was dumped, 342 crates of it. Today, that was worth almost like, I think, over $2 million worth of tea. It was a lot of tea. And by the way, what's the deal with tea? Remember, this is the 1770s, okay? 1700s in general. You're not going to be drinking water because then you're going to get diseases and die of dysentery. And so you could choose to drink alcohol and always be imbibed, or you could drink tea. And so many colonists developed, and most people in Europe, everywhere, developed a very big fondness for tea. Like I said, this tea came from China. Actually, a third of it was green tea. Actually, it's some of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington really liked. I like green tea too. Got that matcha. So that is what is happening. They're meeting at the meeting hall, and basically Samuel Adams says, you know, we've done everything we can. We've warned the captains of these ships not to unload the tea. The captains of the ships really didn't want to unload the tea. They wanted to go back to London and not be tarred and feathered. So they were like, we don't want to do this. Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts, he was like, you're gonna unload the tea though, because he is a patriotic British subject. And so there's really, the captains of the ship were between a rock and a hard place. They really, you know, had no choice here on what to do. And so Samuel Adams wipes his hands of it and says, you know, there's nothing more that I can say. Actions, it's the time for action. So he didn't order the thing to happen, but he basically did. And of course, he and the other famous leaders of the Sons of Liberty, they stay behind in the meeting house for like plausible deniability and don't actually take part in the dumping of the tea. And then you will see coming out of the meeting hall and joining on the streets to go to Griffin's Wharf there in Boston, you'll see hundreds of these Sons of Liberty and other rabble rousers dressed as Mohawk Native Americans. They literally took suit and blackened their faces. They put on war paint, feathers. They didn't do this because they thought people would actually believe that like Mohawk or Narragansett natives were interested in tea and dumping it into the harbor. They did this for the very like obvious reason that they were committing an illegal act against the British Crown and Parliament. And this was a way to kind of disguise their identities, or at least give them like some plausible disguise. When somebody's like, hey, I saw you dumping tea, they could be like, oh yeah, really? I thought those were Native Americans. I mean, it's weak, but it's there. Also, maybe it was more of a symbolic gesture as well. Like, keep in mind, Native Americans have been fighting colonial rule in many different ways for hundreds of years by this point. So the act of dressing up like a Native American is an act of like sticking the middle finger to Britain and basically saying, we are, you know, rebelling against your authority, just like Native Americans have rebelled against colonial rule. So that's what they dress up as Native Americans. And many people in Boston, like average civilians, like go outside their homes and are like watching as these Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawks like walk down the streets and with tomahawks and with other stuff. And they watch them go to the wharf, and nobody really stops them. The reason for this is again obvious. If you remember our previous lecture, remember that in the Boston Massacre, the soldiers and the colonists were not getting along. That martial rule of Boston had led to the massacre. Well, Governor Hutchinson is forced to remove the soldiers that were stationed in the city outside of the city to the next port across the harbor in Charleston or Charlestown. And so the night of December 16th, 1773, when the Boston Tea Party is occurring, there were no British soldiers housed in Boston to prevent this act from occurring. And that's why all these Boston townspeople are bearing witness to it. Everybody's just watching it happen. And overall, it was a pretty orderly event. It's not the, woo, you know, hoot and holler and party type thing that we think about. The Sons of Liberty were, taking direct political action to protest the injustice of this tax. Now, just a moment on this tax, the injustice of it, it didn't raise the tax on tea. The Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered, remember, like the Sugar Act, it actually lowered the tax on tea. So why were they dumping this tea and getting all ruffled and, literally feathered about it? Well, it's just the act of taxing without representation and the slippery slope that could develop if they allowed this to happen. Think of also the moneyed interests, the corruption of parliamentary members forcing this tax in order to benefit their business connections. All right, so this is a political stand. It's not about the tax on tea because that's ridiculous. It lowered the tax on tea. But remember, keep in mind, many of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty were into smuggling. Like, John Hancock was a smuggler of like cheaper French tea from the West Indies and from other places. If the British East India tea, the price was lowered on it, and then, colonists are getting their tea from the British East India Company, well, that hurts John Hancock's business. They won't be buying from him now. They'll be buying from the British East India Company. So this is all the things at play here. But overall, this was about the fundamental rights that the colonists had as British citizens, that they were not being represented in Parliament, that this was an unfair tax that they had no part in, speaking their piece on. And if they allowed this one tax to go through, well, then what would be next? So that's why they did it. And like I said, it's an orderly procession. They get to the three ships. It was the Beaver, the Dartmouth, and the Eleanor. I think those were the names of the three ships. The Beaver or the Dartmouth, one of those had literally just gotten to the port, like literally the night before this had happened. And so the captain, he hadn't been sitting there, for weeks like the other captains, wringing his hands and being like, oh my God, I'm going to either be tarred and feathered or I'm going to have to go back to London and face the consequences. Like, what do you do? This guy just, had his ship come into this mess. And so he very politely, this captain asked the Sons of Liberty dressed up like Mohawk natives, he says, please don't break anything on my ship. Don't destroy any of my other property. I get that you're after the tea. Please don't hurt anything else on my ship. And this is an American, British colonist. So the Sons of Liberty, they actually say, sure, yeah, we'll keep your ship safe. And so they literally unload all the rest of his cargo and put it out on the wharf while they're, breaking up the tea boxes and crates and throwing them in the harbor. And then they repack all of his cargo from the wharf back onto his ship. They make sure that they didn't destroy anything. I think one lock on one cabin door had been broken when they were searching for the crates of tea. So like two Sons of Liberty actually run back into Boston proper and they go to a little shop and they buy a new lock to replace it. Because they really wanted this to be an orderly affair that was showing the Crown and Parliament that they were serious about protesting civilly, that they were fighting for an injustice. They're not just thugs, in other words. They had a point to what they were doing. In total, like I said, 342 crates, these brick tea was dumped. Boston Harbor is a big teapot now for a while. It's going to be brewing. And that was the destruction of the tea, the Boston Tea Party, it will eventually be known. Not all of our famous founding fathers were totally rah-rah on board with what had happened. Some of them were kind of displeased at the actions of the Sons of Liberty on that cold December night. Among those chiefly was Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Remember, George Washington is all about property and land ownership and this other stuff. He was a surveyor, and now he's, by this point, a wealthy Virginia planter. So when he heard about the destruction of this private property on these American ships, this was, tea from the British East India Company. It's private property. It wasn't tea from, like, the king. George Washington was actually pretty dismayed, and he wrote that in a letter and said that he did not approve of what they had done. Benjamin Franklin, very similar. So it's not like the Boston Tea Party directly led to the fighting of the American Revolution. So how are we going to get there? Shabam. It's Parliament's reaction to the Tea Party that's going to cause the angst and the fighting, okay? So in January of 1774, the following year, it's a month later, Parliament gets word of what had happened. Because remember, its communication is slow to arrive across the Atlantic. It takes ships many months, or in case many weeks, to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. So in January of 1774, Parliament reacts and they pass what in Britain are called the coercive acts. But in the colonies, you should definitely note, these were known as the intolerable acts. Intolerable. Okay. And it was a series of 5 laws, 5 acts that were passed. The first one was the Boston Port Act. And this one actually closed the port of Boston. It was set to go in effect in June of 1774, but they actually start blockading. The British Navy will blockade the port of Boston and not allow any ships of any variety to go into the port. And this is going to starve off not just Boston, but the rest of Massachusetts that relied on the port to get most of its supplies. This was very what we call punitive, which means it was meant to punish. It was definitely meant to punish the people of Boston for dumping all that tea into the harbor and sticking it to Parliament. And what it does is it punishes everybody for the acts of just the Sons of Liberty, just the few. It's like, have you ever been in a classroom where these 2 kids are talking or doing something rude and disruptive, and the teacher stops everything and punishes the entire class just for those few students who were causing trouble? Well, is that fair? Not really. If you ask the other students, they're like, no, I didn't do anything. Why should I be punished? And that's how many people felt at this first part of the Intolerable Acts. The closure of the Boston port was very punishing, and it brought a lot of people who, had mixed feelings about all this onto the Patriot side. It also meant that a lot of the other colonies started to feel some sympathy for Boston and for Massachusetts as a whole. Many people from other colonies and from those committees of correspondence that we've been talking about that are going to start to become much more important now, they're going to send supplies to their brothers in Boston and in Massachusetts to keep them going. In fact, tons of supplies are sent, so much grain that I think John Adams or someone joked that Boston could soon become the grain capital of the United States because so much aid and assistance was being sent to Massachusetts from these other colonies because their port was closed. So that kind of backfires. The second of the Intolerable Acts was the Massachusetts Government Act. And this actually provoked even more outrage than the port closure because it unilaterally took away the Massachusetts Charter, the original government that John Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony had had. Remember, they're very proud to rule themselves. Their town meeting with the church was all important in that Puritan society. That has all been stripped from Massachusetts, from the entire colony. They're limited to 1 meeting per year. They no longer can elect their colonial assembly. It has been disbanded. The only government that they have is now going to be directly appointed by the royally appointed governor, Parliament in London, or the King of England. So they are being directly controlled now. No more self-government for Massachusetts. That was seen as extremely rude by Massachusetts. So their government was stripped from them. The third of the Intolerable Acts was the Administration of Justice Act, more commonly referred to by George Washington as the Murder Act. This one actually said that if you were a British tax collector or official or soldier or any capacity of the British government like that in Boston, enforcing these laws, if you were to be in a case involving a dispute with a colonist, like say in the Boston Massacre, where soldiers were accused of, murdering colonists, then you would be sent to trial in Halifax or in London, elsewhere, not in the colonies. And the reason George Washington called this the Murder Act is that basically it allowed British authorities to do whatever they wanted to the colonists without any punishment. They could literally get away with murder. So that's kind of an extension of those admiralty courts we've been talking about, but now it's for British citizens. And this is seen as really just messed up by Massachusetts people in general, because remember, after the Boston Massacre, John Adams himself, one of our, patriot, rabble-rousing, leaders, he had been the lawyer defending those British soldiers, ensuring that they got a fair trial in the colonies. He made sure that facts and evidence prevailed. And yet here Britain is basically saying that the colonies couldn't have fair trials, weren't able to administer justice. This was seen as an outrage and preposterous, especially with, the memory of the Boston Massacre trials so recent. The fourth of the acts is probably the most famous. And this is the one we've talked about a little bit before, because they also had one passed in 1765. But this is the famous Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act here is going to apply to not just Massachusetts, but all the colonies. And it sought to create a more effective method of housing the British troops than what the previous Quartering Act had done. Under the previous act, the colonies have been required to provide housing for soldiers, but the colonial assemblies and legislatures had been kind of uncooperative in doing so. This new Quartering Act, under the Intolerable Acts, it actually allowed the royal governors to house soldiers in other buildings, public buildings, and others, or abandoned buildings, if suitable quarters were not provided. It didn't actually allow troops to be billeted in private homes. That claim is largely a myth, but only permitted troops to be quartered in unoccupied buildings. All right, and then finally, that brings us to the final of the Intolerable Acts, and that is the Quebec Act. And it's kind of different from the others because it's not meant as a direct punishment to the people of Boston and Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, but it still was passed along with these others. So we lump it in with the Intolerable Acts, and it's going to be really important later on, also during the Revolutionary War. What the Quebec Act did, remember Quebec is this important city in Canada, remember at the end of the French and Indian War? The Plains of Abraham and Wolfe and what is the Canadian French general? Montebleu. I don't remember I don't remember what his name is. Oh, that's gonna drive me crazy. I keep wanting to say Montesquieu. No, I don't know. Anyway, those two generals died there, Plains of Abraham. That was the end of the French Indian War fighting, really. What the Quebec Act did was it extended the territory of the Quebec province into the Ohio country, which a lot of colonists are going to be really mad about that. Because remember, they're always wanting that Ohio country. And then the other thing it did was it basically protected French, former Canadian, former French, Canadian British subjects, especially in particular ensuring their right to their religion, Catholicism. Keep in mind that most colonists at this time are Protestant faiths, like the Church of England, Anglicanism, Puritanism. Those were what were brought over by the original British colonists who settled these 13 original colonies. The French colonists that were in Canada that get taken over by Britain in the French and Indian War, who are now British subjects, many of them were Catholic, like the Acadians who were expelled. And so these Catholic British citizens, they were worried about religious persecution. The Quebec Act will protect them. And in doing so, will kind of ensure their loyalty later on. Because the new American, Continental Congress is going to make some overtures when we start fighting Britain to the Canadian provinces and basically say, hey, you guys, y'all are going to join us, right? We're all in this together against the evil British. And those Canadians, like, because of the Quebec Act, they say, no, we actually kind of like British rule. They protect our faith. They've been good to us. We're going to stick with them. So that's going to be very important later on. That was the Quebec Act. And the first four, the punishing ones, it meant to isolate Massachusetts, particularly the city of Boston, because that was where Britain really saw most of the troublemakers like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty coming from. But what the Intolerable Acts really did was banded the colonies together in opposition to British rule, because it showed just how authoritarian, how over controlling and toxic Parliament could be. So it backfired. Provide examples of amendments in the Bill of Rights, that's the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, that trace back to colonial grievances against the British. How many can we name? Well, we have the freedom of religion. We just talked about that, that we'll see evidenced by the Quebec Act. We'll see also the right to assemble being a grievance addressed by the First Continental Congress, the right to petition and ask for redress for grievances. That's all going to be very important parts of our First Amendment, our 5 freedoms. We're going to be talking a lot when we get to the shot heard round world and the first battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. But keep in mind at this point in time that there is no formal police in charge of protecting the populace. That's why militias were formed. They were like a group of your citizens, a citizen military for each city that was meant to protect the community. That's a militia. The Third Amendment, you can see that's with the Quartering Act, or the Quartering Acts, plural, I should say. Remember that Britain wanted a way to house British soldiers in colonial properties, and colonists did not like having British soldiers being foisted upon them. So no quartering of troops, that's the Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment directly relates to the writs of assistance. Remember what those were? Those were like those messed up search warrants. Well, the Fourth Amendment actually says no unlawful searches or seizures. That if the police need to search your private residence or any of your personal property or your person, they must have a search warrant issued by a judge with reasonable cause, like why the judge would give this. And then the Fifth, the Sixth, the Seventh, the Eighth amendments all deal with your rights to a fair trial. Because keep in mind, remember, British American colonists, they would have to spend a long time awaiting trial, being shipped off to foreign lands up in Canada or across the ocean for their trials. They also would not be heard by a jury of their peers. They would be heard by a severely biased royal judge. So those are just a few of the examples of why we eventually will add those rights in our Constitution. And remember, those are among the very first, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that we add to our Constitution when we draft that in the late 1780s. All right, the last thing I want to talk about in our lecture today, the First Continental Congress. In reaction to the Intolerable Acts, the British Coercive Acts, the committees of correspondence are going to choose among them some delegates, which they will send to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Carpenter's Hall, not yet Independence Hall. They'll do that for the Second Continental Congress, to basically meet together and decide what to do. So formal gathering of the colonies, let's get it. It's happening. We're unifying. It's here. All but one will show up. The only colony of the 13 that does not attend this First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774. Don't know why that says 1775, my bad. It should be 1774. They meet in the fall, is going to be Georgia. Georgia doesn't go because they're fighting Native Americans and they need British assistance. And just speaking plain talk here for a second, they don't really care that much what's happening to Boston. So there you go. They got their own problems, to be fair to Georgia. So 12 of the colonies attend, and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And you got to think, for a lot of these delegates, like, this was really cool. Many of them had never been, like, this far away from their homes. They'd never been and met these other people that they've been corresponding with. So, but like John Adams writing in his diary, he's like, everybody here thinks they're so awesome and smart, but I mean, these were like a lot of really important founding fathers that are meeting for the first time. Here, I want to show you the list just really quickly, because I think it's kind of cool to see who's getting a chance to finally meet. And can I do that? There we go. Let's see. So in attendance here, take a look at the list of names. From Massachusetts, you have John and Samuel Adams. The cousins both attend. From Connecticut, you're going to have Roger Sherman, who is actually the only man to sign all 4 of the important early governing documents: the Declaration, the Continental Association here. He signs the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And Roger Sherman actually had been part of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. So Roger Sherman, really important dude, he's going to be there. From New York, you have John Jay, who will be our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, negotiates Jay's Treaty, very important under the Washington administration. So John Jay is in attendance. From Pennsylvania, you have John Dickinson. Remember, he wrote Letters from Pennsylvania Farmer, an indictment of those Townshend Acts that kind of helped keep the revolutionary spirit going. From Delaware, oh, and by the way, Pennsylvania, you might be wondering, hopefully, whose name is missing. Benjamin Franklin, right? Where's he? He's in Europe. Remember, during all this time, Benjamin Franklin is over in Europe. And oh, by the way, after the Boston Tea Party, there was a huge roast that the king's advisors, basically they interviewed Benjamin Franklin again, and it wasn't so much of an interview as just a let's hate on Benjamin Franklin and complain that he's the reason why all this happened. And they were roasting him pretty hard. So he's off in Europe. From, let's see, who else of note here? From Virginia, I mean, all these names, but Benjamin Harrison, the founding father, he actually is going to go on to become the father of William Henry Harrison, future president, famous for being president for only like 32 days or something. He dies from a cold. And also his grandson, Benjamin Harrison, I guess the, junior or whatever, his grandson is also going to be president later on in the 1800s. Patrick Henry of "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," which he will utter actually in March of 1775, hasn't uttered it yet. He will be in attendance. Richard Henry Lee, who famously passed he was the one to come up with the declaration that declared us free and independent, the Lee resolution. He's there. And don't forget, George Washington was in attendance at this first Continental Congress, impressing many people and probably laying the foundation for them to choose him to be our commander-in-chief. Let's see, and the Rutledges, very young, from South Carolina. So we got some famous people showing up here at the first Continental Congress, laying the foundation for our independence. But they're not actually talking about independence at this point. These delegates that attend in the fall of 1774, they're talking about addressing grievances. How can we get back together with Parliament and make this thing work? And so they end up drafting the Continental Association, which is going to basically urge all of the colonies not to export or import British goods, to do a boycott like they've done before, and put the pressure on Parliament. Because remember, that worked before. That really has worked in the past. They're going to try it again, and it will be somewhat successful. It's definitely going to make Parliament and King George have to make some decisions. So that was the biggest thing they decided: non-importation, do a boycott. They also draft a petition to the king, because many people felt like, oh, well, King George is reasonable. Parliament, they're being totally, unreasonable. We have no representation there. But the king, he is our king. Maybe he'll listen to us. And so they draft their list of grievances, their complaints, and they're going to send it on to the king, who of course is going to kind of shred it up and not be very reasonable listening to it, because these guys are almost in open rebellion. But they're not talking about independence yet. Now, from the fall of 1774, they agreed that they'll meet again the next spring to kind of talk about and discuss the next steps based on what King George is going to do when he gets their petition. And of course, the king ignores their petition, addresses none of their grievances. In March of 1775, before the Congress can reconvene in a second Continental Congress, that is when down in Virginia, Patrick Henry is going to fight against the Loyalist sympathizers and basically proclaim, in probably one of the most famous patriotic speeches of them all, Patrick Henry shall say, "It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace with Britain. But there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is that the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" Ironic for Virginians to say that, right? "Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." So Patrick Henry says that in March of 1775. The following month, April of 1775, we're going to have the shot heard round the world and the beginning of the American Revolution. But we don't yet have a Declaration of Independence. That will come after the first fighting, when the Second Continental Congress will reconvene. All right, with that, I'm going to talk to you guys later. Thank you for listening.